Hello Orchid friends, how are you? Welcome back to my channel. If this is your first time watching my video, my channel is all about orchids. From what orchids I have, how I grow them, my thoughts on certain orchid topics, to what orchids in my collection are blooming, etc. So if you want to follow along my orchid hobby adventure, please consider subscribing to my channel and turn on the notification. Earlier this year, when the weather was still pretty warm, I decided to repot 5 of my Phalaenopsis orchid. One of them is a Bellina, so it's a species, and the other 4 are primary hybrids. And there are 2 that are close to primary hybrids, and those are my 2 lovely Sweet Memory M. These orchids came to me potted in sphagnum moss. And before I remove sphagnum moss from orchid, typically I like to soak them really well with water. And the biggest benefit is it's much easier to remove moss from roots. And when you're flushing roots with, or trying to wash roots down with water, the tiny pieces of sphagnum moss that are trapped or caught in between roots can easily be removed when they're wet versus when they're dry. Because when sphagnum moss is dry, it's really crispy, and when you're trying to peel off or take off the sphagnum moss that's sticking to the orchid root, sometimes you potentially can damage the root system that way. So I like to soak orchids really well when I'm removing the sphagnum moss, or any kind of media. For example, if an orchid is potted in bark chips, the same thing, the same theory applies. You should just soak them really well, because that allows the medium to come off roots much easier. Semi-hydroponics is the setup that I'm going to try with these 5 orchids. I wasn't quite sure at first, but since that I've had quite a lot of success with semi-hydro method with quite a few of my orchids, I think that these 5 orchids should do pretty well in that setup as well. And soaking these water in advance also has another great benefit. With semi-hydro, I usually wait a week or even 2 weeks sometimes after they are put into the semi-hydro setup before I would give water. So if you soak these orchid well in advance, that also allows this orchid to soak up enough water for the first 2 weeks in semi-hydro, because I'm not giving them water, because my goal is to allow these orchids to try to adopt or get adapted to semi-hydro setup during the first 2 weeks in a slightly drier, less moist condition. Because if you put them into semi-hydro and then you fill up the reservoir right away, sometimes that could be too much moisture too quickly, and that may cause root rot, in my own opinion. And now let's quickly take a look at these orchids. So this one is a primary hybrid between Gigantea and Violacea. The roots were looking pretty good, and it took me some time to get rid of the sphagnum moss, but it was well worth it. And this one is Gigantea and Bellina cross. Also pretty healthy roots. And then this one is a species. It's a Bellina. That's right, it's a cross between Bellina Blue and Bellina Big Lip. It produced 3 flowers this year. The flower spike is now yellowed, but it's okay. I'm confident that it will, flower for us in the near future. It also has pretty decent root system, I would say. And then here are the 2 Sweet Memory M that I have. They both also have pretty decent root system, so I'm really happy. One of them actually had a little bit of fungus at the bottom of the cup, so it was also a good opportunity for me to just simply, transfer them into a new setup anyway. And what I like to do after I clean up or remove all the sphagnum moss is that I obviously would use alcohol and hydrogen peroxide to disinfect the root system, just to make sure there's no more hitchhiker or any kind of fungus spores or anything that we don't want in the root system or in the media. And then after they're all cleaned up, I like to place them on a flat surface and let them dry out for around 24-hour period. And this is a good window opportunity for us to further inspect the root system before they're put into the semi-hydro setup. During this 24 hours, sometimes, and this is something I learned when I am converting regular setup to water culture setup. Sometimes after you clean up the root system, during this 24-hour period, some roots may continue to decay and rot, and this 24 hours period really just allow you to further inspect and remove those decaying roots before they are converted or put into the new setup, so that way they're not rotting in the semi-hydro container or in water if you're doing water culture setup. And here is the media that I have, the material that I have at home. So in semi-hydro, I like to use a mixture of manto clay and hydrocorn. The bigger pebbles are hydrocorn, and I really don't have a set ratio. Usually it's 1-to-1, sometimes 1-to-2, but I also have a couple orchid that's just potted in pure hydrocorn. And it just really depends on your preference and also your environment and what you're comfortable with. I play with the ratios all the time depending on what I see on a given orchid. So there isn't really like a set rule that you have to use just one type of medium for semi-hydro or what kind of ratio if you are mixing different kinds of different sizes of the pebbles from different brands. But what I like to do, though, I like to share this with you, is within the reservoir I like to use bigger chunks of pebbles, and then right around the level of the two holes just above the reservoir I will start adding a thin layer of small pebbles. And here you can see I did some mistake, I broke a couple root tips. Oh well. And here you see this is the final product. Any space above the two holes or above the reservoir, the mixing ratio really just depends on what I see on the roots to decide. But usually it's 1-to-1, sometimes 1-to-2, like 1 part manto clay to 2 parts bigger pebble hydrocorn. And here's just a video clip to show you what they look like after they're all potted. One thing I do want to share with you, and this is more of a personal preference, is the way that I place my tag is facing outside when they're in the cup. I don't like to pull out the tag often because I think sometimes I may potentially hurt the roots. Taking out the tag, putting in the tag. So I just kind of use this method because my container is transparent anyway. So every time I pull out the container from the outer cup, the outer blue cup, I get to see the name right away, and I don't have to bother with taking out the tag and then putting it in afterwards. And another thing I want to share is that usually I wait, like I said earlier, I usually wait 1 to 2 weeks before I give these newly potted, converted semi-hydro orchids any water. And I don't worry about them during this period because they still have enough water. Number one, they were soaked quite a bit when they were still potted in sphagnum moss. That's one thing. And number two, as I prepare manto clay and hydrocorn, I obviously wash them and I obviously also soak them after they're clean. So there is definitely enough moisture within the cup, either from the water that the roots already have or absorbed, but then also the moisture that these pebbles already contain in them. So I'm not worried during this 1 to 2 weeks. Usually I wait until 2 weeks, and then I soak them really well again and then drain until that there is just enough water within the reservoir. Most of my orchids really like semi-hydro, and most of my orchids also have very little adjustment period or difficulty adjusting to this method. But I do have one or two that are slightly struggling, and I intend to observe them and try to make videos and share with you their progress when I have time to do that. This is all I have for you today. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up. And if you would like to get more orchid related videos from my channel, please subscribe and turn on the notification. I want to wish you happy growing, and I will talk to you in my next video. Ciao!